What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous build for the Warpriest, the Devil's Advocate. Now, this build should be good for core difficulty if you know what you're doing. However, I would not use it on any difficulty above that point, as with this build, I really kind of leaned into a bit of a theme. And as such, I'm going to make some choices that are probably not ideal in some cases. However, I will offer some alternatives, as there's a few minor tweaks you can make here or there to actually make this much more effective than the slightly more themed build that I was going for. But nonetheless, this is an idea that I had been kicking around for a while about the Warpriest cult leader archetype that struck me as a lot of fun, and I'm getting around to it and showing it off to you guys. So with no further ado, let's jump right into this and talk about character creation. So if you are unfamiliar with Warpriests, they are essentially a hybrid class that combines class features from the fighter as well as the cleric class. Their base attack bonus is going to be average, their health is going to be pretty average, they are a wisdom caster and they are going to get level 6 spells at the end. They memorize those spells, and furthermore, while they only get level 6 spells, they do get their full set of caster levels, which means the spells they can cast are nonetheless pretty effective. We're going to be using the cult leader archetype, and a few things change there, so let's go over those real quick. For starters, our proficiencies are going to change a little bit. Rather than getting medium and heavy armor proficiency, we're only going to be able to use light armor, which honestly isn't too big of a deal if you understand that being lightly or unarmored is really the way to go, and can be easily cheesed to give you a much higher armor class than an armored character. In addition to those things, rather than getting some of the extra combat feats we would normally get, we are going to instead be getting sneak attack damage every few levels, and we're also going to be getting some bonuses to stealth and sneak should you choose to take advantage of them. And the Warpriest as a whole actually also gets the enhanced weapon and sacred armor class features that we see elsewhere, which allows you to grant an enhancement bonus to either your weapon or your armor. However, that does not stack with the normal enhancement bonuses that those things get, and as a result, you can choose to use that bonus to instead add effects to your weapons, which we'll get into. But the general gist of the Warpriest is to kind of combine a more divine caster type with a melee-focused class. They can do very well in melee, and they have a lot of options to engage in melee combat. Now, the cult leader specifically does forego some extra combat feats in exchange for sneak attack damage, like I mentioned, though. But from there, let's talk races. So I would recommend two, either human or Aasimar. Human is a hard race to pull away from in this game because they get an extra feat at character creation, which is just very helpful in general. And as such, humans can be very, very good. However, Aasimar is a great alternative as they get a lot of options to move their initial attribute allocation around through picking a heritage, and thus there are a few combinations here where you could easily kind of move something the way you want it to go. But then we have our background. Now this is going to change a bit depending on the exact type of weapon you want to use, but for me personally, there are a couple that I like in particular. If you want to use a greatsword, then I would recommend the leader background type, but while that is kind of in general the theme I had for this build, any two-handed weapon would really work here, and picking a background that is going to coincide with whatever two-handed weapon you want to use is. That way you can get the proficiency bonus from the background, as the Warpriest will already be proficient with martial weapons, which means if you pick one of these backgrounds, you're going to get a bonus to your attack rolls instead, which can be very helpful. Now, again, I like leader specifically because it kind of lends into the themed build that we're going here for our cult leader. However, if you want to use like a great axe or something, you could pick lumberjack instead. Now, for our ability points or attributes, we need strength and wisdom. I like to take those both to 18. Drop charisma, we're not really going to be using that at all. And then take Constitution to 12, which gives us 18 Strength and Wisdom, 12 Constitution, and 7 Charisma if you're a human. That's personally how I like to do it, but you got some options there. And then for our skills, from the way we have it set up, we'd get the most bonuses out of Athletics, Lore Nature, Lore Religion, and Perception. But as always, Perception is king, and for your main character, I like to have it. But from there, we pick up Feats. Now, this is where I need to explain Sacred Weapon. In order to use Sacred Weapon, you have to have the weapon-focused feat for that weapon for it to count as your Warpriest's Sacred Weapon. We'll talk a bit more about Sacred Weapon later, but it is very important that at level 1, you pick up Weapon Focus for whatever weapon you would like to use for this. Great sword, great club, great axe, whatever floats your boat, but it's got to be one of those. Now, if you're a human and you get a second feat, you're going to want either Power Attack or Blind Fight. I find both of those pretty equally valuable. Blind Fight is very good because it makes you immune to gaze attacks, as well as making it very difficult to lose your Dexterity to Armor bonus. However, because we're a Strength build, we don't necessarily need to worry about our Dexterity. But that said, Blind Fight does make you immune to gaze attacks, which a lot of boss enemies do use, and can save you some headaches. But Power Attack or Blind Fight there. Now for our deity, I like to go Asmodeus here because with our cult leader and this being the devil's advocate, devils are lawful evil creatures, and we are going to be serving the lawful evil devil himself, Asmodeus. Now from there we have to pick spontaneous casting. So this is part of the Warpriest kit. Instead of getting channel energy like a cleric would, they get spontaneous inflict or spontaneous cure, depending on their alignment. Now we're going to be evil, so we have to pick spontaneous inflict. But basically, for every spell that we can cast, we can choose instead to cast an appropriately leveled inflict spell at the cost of the spell slot, even though we don't have it prepared. Now, if you were able to either be undead or had spontaneous cure instead, you can use this on yourself as a swift action, which lets you do it and then also make an attack that turn, which for a healer can actually be very, very good. But because we are human or mortal at least, and using inflict, we don't really want to use this on ourselves, so that doesn't come up very much. And then we have our blessings. Blessings are the Warpriest equivalent of cleric domains. Thematically speaking, evil makes a lot of sense, but for the purposes of this adventure, it is basically useless because it gives you extra damage, but only against good aligned creatures. And as most of the creatures in this particular adventure path are chaotic evil, the evil blessing unfortunately does us very little good. So instead, I like to pick up Law and Magic, because Law gives us the same buff as evil, but it applies to chaotic creatures, which is most of what we're going to be fighting. And then Magic actually gives you a ranged attack that lets you throw your weapon using your Wisdom modifier instead of your Dex modifier, which just as a single ranged attack I think is pretty cool. But Fire or Trickery instead of Magic would work as well, but you definitely need Law. So there's character creation down, and if you couldn't tell, what we're really leaning into, of course, is the sort of lawful evil devil thing, which can serve us very well against chaotic enemies that the demons are known to be. Now, from there, let's talk about our character as we level. Now, the most important feats are levels 1 through 9, in terms of this build, I mean. So for level 3, if we didn't grab Power Attack already, we're going to need it. And if you picked Power Attack at 1 instead of now, I would recommend Blind Fight, but you don't necessarily have to grab that. But then at level 5, we're going to pick up Cleave. So if you're unaware of how Cleave works, it's very incredible for two-handed weapons, because this allows us to make a single attack at our full base attack bonus against a foe within reach, of course, so just regular melee range. And if we hit, we get to deal normal damage, but we get to make an additional attack with our full base attack bonus again against a foe that is next to the first, and also within reach. Now, with the base ability, we can only make one additional attack per round. However, we do take a -2 to our armor class as a result. Then at level 6, we're actually going to get a combat feat here from our class, and this is where we're going to pick up Cleaving Finish. If we make that melee attack and our target drops to 0 or fewer hit points as a result of the attack, we can make another melee attack using our highest base attack bonus. And we can only use this once as well. However, it is worth mentioning that this is just used on our melee attacks. We do not have to use the Cleave ability to use Cleaving Finish. However, it does stack with the base Cleave. Then at level 7, we're going to pick up Great Cleave. This modifies the base Cleave a little bit by allowing you to continue to make attacks against foes adjacent to the initial one, so long as they are within your reach. However, you cannot attack each individual foe more than once during this particular action. And then at level 9, we pick up Cleaving Finish, which will let us use Cleaving Finish any number of times per round, which then means if we kill anybody with all these cleave attacks, we just proc Cleaving Finish again, which lets us make an additional attack. Now, past level 9, there are a few other feats you can check out if you would like. These include the extra critical feats, such as giving you better chances to critical or continuing down the weapon focus skill line, which can give you more attack or damage to your chosen weapon. You have a few options, but really the key feats that I wanted to talk about here are all of the cleave feats, as that's something I really enjoy playing around with this particular build. But from there, let's talk about some key features for the Warpriest class. Now, for starters, we have Negative Energy Fervor. This is essentially the same as our spontaneous casting. However, we don't have to use our spell slots to do it. meaning so rather than trading a memorized spell to use the inflict spell list instead, we can use negative energy fervor, which will do essentially the same thing a number of times per day, but not using our spell slots. And then from there, let's talk about Sacred Armor a little bit. So Sacred Armor will let you, as a swift action, give your armor an enhancement bonus that increases as you level up. Now that said, if you're wearing something that is +2 or +3 just by itself, that's already an enhancement bonus, which means it's not going to stack with Sacred Armor. However, as you level up, you'll also get the ability to use Sacred Armor to instead give your armor special abilities, such as Energy Resistance, which is elemental damage. You can give yourself Spell Resistance, which makes it harder for enemies to hit you with spells, or you could even give yourself the Fortification effect, which means enemies will have a chance when they critically hit you to just not critically hit you. And each of these abilities, when used, counts against the total enhancement bonus provided to your armor. But again, you're not really going to get any benefit out of this anyway, because that enhancement bonus really doesn't stack. So the only time you would get any use at all out of the base ability for this is if you were, say, level 19, so you got a +5 bonus, and you were wearing like +3 armor for some reason. That would give you actually 2 more AC to use Sacred Armor in that case, but the vast majority of the time you're not actually going to get any benefit from using Sacred Armor. Now, Sacred Weapon is the exact same thing, but for your weapon. However, that comes with a few more things to mention though. So Sacred Weapon, again, applies to any weapon that you have weapon focus for. Second, using Sacred Weapon uses your level as the scale for damage instead of the actual weapon damage. In some cases that's better, in some cases that's worse. So early game, you really need to pay attention to that. Late game, Sacred Weapon usually winds up, generally speaking, being better because you can add your Sacred Weapon effects to it. Much like with the armor, we get the option to add extra various points of damage in exchange for the bonuses that would normally go to our weapon as an enhancement bonus. So a particularly good one is the lawful one that will just give you extra damage to chaos creatures, which is most of what you're going to be fighting. So a lot of getting the most out of the Warpriest is using these things effectively, which is why I took the time to go over it. Now, from there, let's talk a little bit about equipment. And honestly, there's no special equipment you need for this. Depending on the weapon you choose to use, there are some weapons you'll definitely want to pick up. For instance, if you chose to go the scythe route, you can get the wide sweep scythe in Act 2 that really chains attacks with cleave incredibly well. So if you want to use a two-handed scythe, you'd pick up wide sweep. Now, this is the downside of going the greatsword route if you want to go that route, is that unfortunately there's not a ton of amazing greatswords in the game. There's a couple unique ones, but for the most part, you're going to be buying the more standard generated magic stuff from the vendors instead, which is why if you want to be more effective and don't care about it being a greatsword specifically, I would instead recommend either a scythe or a great axe, as you can find some really cool great axes and some really cool scythes throughout the game. But as far as your actual equipment goes, really just the best you can find will work out, honestly. If you want to metagame a little bit and take some monk levels, you can actually use your very high wisdom modifier to go completely unarmored as well, since we're using light armor anyway without a dex bonus, which means it's not very effective. So again, if you wanted to take some monk levels, you could get a much higher AC than you would with heavy armor anyway, as they get their wisdom bonus to their AC, etc. However, that's just an option and not necessarily required. But beyond that, again, just the best stuff you can find. Anything that's going to pump your AC up, anything that's going to raise your ability scores. But luckily, we're pretty wide open equipment-wise outside of those things. So from there, let's talk spell casting a little bit. Now, as I mentioned, we are going to get up to level 6 spells. Moreover, we also get basically the cleric spell list, and early game I would say focus on buffs. Use things like Bless, Cure Light Wounds, Divine Favor, stuff that's going to give you bonuses to your attack rolls or make it harder for enemies to hit you. However, starting around spell level 3 or spell level 4, you do get access to some pretty good ranged spells, such as Searing Light, or one of my personal favorites, a level 4 spell known as Order's Wrath, which deals a lot of extra damage to chaotic creatures specifically, which again is most of what we're going to be fighting. Now, the buffs are pretty self-explanatory. Use them to buff yourself. But spells here actually maintain their effectiveness for our Warpriest as long as we can break through enemy spell resistance. So I wouldn't necessarily attack enemies with a lot of spell resistance. But if you find enemies where it's relatively low and you're likely to be able to hit them, it can be useful to use some of these level 4 through level 6 damage spells that you're going to get as a Warpriest, because we still get our full caster level, even though we only get level 6 spells, which means as a result, the damage we can get out of our spells is pretty solid. And while it's nothing to write home about exactly compared to the merged spellbooks of some of the full casters, it is nonetheless pretty good and provides us some range relief, as being a melee character will suffer from, having to get to the enemy in a lot of cases. But early game, focus on the buffs. Late game, you can absolutely start using some of these ranged spells, and by late game, I mean more like mid game. Now, from there, let's talk Mythic Path. Now, ideally, we're going to become the Devil Mythic Path towards the end of the game. However, in order to become the Devil, you have to first choose either Aeon or Azada when you pick your Mythic Path. Now, Azada wouldn't make a lot of sense for us as we're lawful evil, so I would go Aeon myself. Aeon is going to give you a bunch of defensive capabilities, which is going to make up for our light armor with no real dexterity. This is going to help you out if you choose not to metagame as a monk, because a monk dip is just factually going to give you way more AC and make you much more survivable. But going Aeon is a viable alternative, or just more on top, if you will. Being an Aeon gives you a ton of immunities, as well as gives you the ability to buff your party quite a bit via giving them caster levels, attack rolls. But not only can you use your Enforcing Gazes to buff your party, you can also simultaneously use them to take the same thing away from your enemies, making you stronger and your enemy weaker, which is the name of the game. Now, in order to become the Devil, you have to side with the Devil Advisor you're going to get in Dresden, which will then open up the opportunity to become the Devil Mythic Path later. I've made videos about that you can check out. However, I will say that, unfortunately, especially for the theme of this build, that the Devil is honestly kind of the weakest Mythic Path. It's got some cool things going for it, but it's late game. It's not super strong compared to a lot of the others. So because of that, you might just want to stick with Aeon till the end and kind of pretend you didn't have to betray the Devil guy anyway, which would kind of violate the roleplay that we're going for here, which is being the Devil's advocate, thus becoming the Devil with our Mythic Path. Kind of do what you will in that regard, but my recommendation would be Aeon into the Devil Mythic Path if you want to go full RP, or just stick to Aeon if you prefer to do so. Now, the last thing I want to mention about Mythic Paths are some of the abilities that you're going to want to pick up. So for your mythic abilities, you want to pick up melee-focused things like Last Stand. I'm a big fan of Thundering Blows myself, as it will deal sonic damage even if you miss, but Last Stand is a big one as it makes you immune to death for a few rounds. Dimensional Retribution can actually be very good as well. This will allow you to teleport to ranged attackers, which as a melee character can help you close the distance quite a bit. But beyond that, it's kind of just whatever floats your boat. You don't necessarily need any of the mythic abilities to make this work, and they're just kind of extra stuff on top of what we're already doing. But I would pick up Last Stand for sure, just to make you more survivable, Thunderous Blows again, and Dimensional Retribution. Those are my three favorites, but do what you will. Now for your mythic feats, honestly, just kind of whatever floats your boat. For the most part, you're just going to be picking the mythic version of the feats you've already picked, which will increase them a bit, as we're not doing any type of elemental damage, etc. So we don't need extra spell slots. We don't really need Ascendant Element or anything like that. We can just focus on enhancing our regular feats with their mythic versions. Now, let's talk combat a little bit. Our effectiveness is honestly going to vary. A lot of our feats really work off of having enemies tightly clustered together. So if the enemies are spread out, or if you're only attacking one target, you're still going to do decent damage as long as you hit, because you're still going to be making a full attack. Reality is our best case scenario is tightly grouped enemies that we can hit multiple times via cleave. Now, if we get that combo off successfully, even against like 2 targets, you can do as much as 150 damage by the time you hit level 9, which for a melee class, not bad. It'll see you through on core difficulty for sure. But honestly, the real challenge of playing this class is closing the distance, which is why abilities like Dimensional Retribution or your Magic Blessing Throne attack can be actually really helpful, or using your spells once you've gotten to those higher Warpriest levels where you can actually use them effectively against chaotic creatures. And a lot of this class and playing it in combat comes down to how well you can manage that ranged to melee flow. But in broad terms, like every other fight in the game, or any other class, if you will, we're going to buff up, we're going to turn our sacred weapon, our sacred armor on, make sure that we have the appropriate buffs for sacred armor and weapon turned on. We're going to use our regular class buffs to help out the rest of the party. Make sure you use all of their buffs to buff you up as well, of course. And then our primary goal is going to be to close distance and start using our cleave abilities, as well as our Aeon Enforcing Gazes, etc. to buff our party and debuff the enemies, and then just go crazy cleaving everything in sight. However, in the event that you can't close that distance, fall back on your ranged priest spells, as well as potentially your thrown weapon attack if nothing else. But a lot of the enjoyment of playing with this build, in my opinion, came down to how effectively you could manage that switch from range to melee. And some people are going to have more fun with that than others. But that's just kind of my 2 cents on the matter. And this has been my Devil's Advocate build for the Warpriest class in Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, please consider leaving a like, commenting, subscribing. Any of that YouTube jazz really does help out. We are growing every day. Cannot thank everyone enough. But regardless of any of that, truly, thank you for watching again. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.